Heavy boots echo across concrete as a group of American engineers approach a secured hangar somewhere in the South Pacific. The year is 1943, and inside this building sits something that has confounded Allied intelligence for 2 years. A captured Mitsubishi G4M bomber, intact and ready for examination. These men are among the best aeronautical minds the United States can deploy to the front lines. They've studied every aircraft in the American arsenal, dissected German designs, and pored over intelligence reports. They think they know what to expect from Japanese engineering. They are about to discover they know nothing at all. The hangar doors swing open, revealing the sleek form of the aircraft the Japanese call hamaki, meaning cigar, for its distinctive fuselage shape. American pilots have given it a different name, Betty. It's an oddly affectionate nickname for a machine that has terrorized Allied forces across thousands of miles of ocean. The bomber sits under harsh electric lights, its aluminum skin gleaming, wings stretching an impressive 25 meters from tip to tip. At first glance, it's beautiful, elegant even, the kind of aircraft that speaks to thoughtful design and careful engineering. The lead engineer, a veteran of Boeing's design teams, runs his hand along the fuselage. He's looking for the telltale signs of armor plating, the reinforced sections that protect crew compartments in every American bomber from the B-17 to the B-25. His fingers find only thin aluminum. He frowns and moves to another section. Same result. He checks the area around the cockpit where pilot protection is paramount in American doctrine. Nothing. Just standard aircraft skin, barely thicker than a soda can. One of the younger engineers has climbed up to examine the wing fuel tanks. What he discovers makes him call out to the others. The fuel tanks are simple aluminum containers, no different from the wing structure itself. There's no rubber lining, no self-sealing mechanism, no inert gas system. In American aircraft, fuel tanks are protected by multiple layers of rubber that automatically seal bullet holes, preventing fuel leakage and reducing fire risk. It's technology that has saved countless American lives. The British developed it, the Americans perfected it, and by 1943, it's standard equipment on every Allied combat aircraft. The Betty has none of it. The engineers gather around a section of the wing they've carefully opened. Inside, they can see the fuel tank construction clearly. It's beautifully made with clean welds and precise manufacturing, but it's completely unprotected. A single bullet, even a small caliber round, would puncture this tank and spill fuel directly into the airstream. A tracer round which burns as it flies would turn this aircraft into an inferno within seconds. The team moves through the aircraft systematically, documenting everything. No armor behind the pilot's seat, no armored glass in the canopy, no fire suppression systems in the engine nacelles, no protected fuel lines. Every safety feature that American engineers consider absolutely essential for crew survival has been deliberately omitted. The weight savings are obvious. The Betty is remarkably light for its size, but the vulnerability is staggering. One engineer voices what they're all thinking. Did they not know how to build these systems, or did they not have the resources? It's a reasonable question. Japan is an island nation with limited natural resources. Perhaps they simply couldn't afford the rubber, the armor plate, the complex systems that Allied aircraft carry as standard equipment. But something doesn't add up. The quality of construction is excellent. The engines are sophisticated, powerful radial designs that show advanced metallurgy and engineering. The aerodynamics are clearly the work of people who understand their craft. This isn't a crude aircraft thrown together by an inferior industrial base. This is a machine built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. So why would they build a bomber that seems designed to kill its own crew? The answer to that question requires understanding a war unlike any other in human history, fought across distances that defy comprehension. The Pacific theater of World War II is not like the war in Europe, where armies clash across borders and bombers fly a few hundred miles to their targets. The Pacific is an ocean that covers nearly half the Earth's surface, dotted with islands separated by thousands of miles of empty water. For Japan, an island empire with ambitions spanning from India to Hawaii, the fundamental challenge of this war is simple and brutal. How do you project military power across distances that no nation has ever had to contemplate? In the late 1930s, as Japan prepared for the war it knew was coming, its military planners faced this question directly. The answer they arrived at would shape every aircraft they built and ultimately doom thousands of their airmen to death. That answer was range. Not speed, not payload, not survivability. Range above everything else. The ability to fly farther than any enemy could imagine, to strike targets that should be safe, to defend an empire spanning an entire ocean. This wasn't a casual decision or a minor design preference. It was a fundamental strategic doctrine that flowed from Japan's geopolitical reality. Look at a map of the Pacific in 1940. Japan holds the home islands, Korea, Manchuria, and much of coastal China. But to secure the resources it needs, particularly oil from the Dutch East Indies, it must control an area stretching thousands of miles south and east. To defend this perimeter, to strike at enemies across this vast space, Japanese aircraft must fly distances that American or European designers never considered necessary. The Mitsubishi design team that began work on the G4M project in 1937 received a specification that seemed almost impossible. The Imperial Japanese Navy wanted a bomber that could fly 3,500 kilometers, carry at least 800 kilograms of bombs or a torpedo, and do so at competitive speeds. For context, the American B-25 Mitchell, considered a medium bomber with good range, could fly about 2,200 kilometers. The Japanese were asking for 60% more range in the same class of aircraft. The engineers at Mitsubishi knew there was only one way to achieve this: weight reduction. Extreme, uncompromising, ruthless weight reduction. Every kilogram saved meant more fuel that could be carried, which meant more range. They began with the obvious targets. Armor plating for the crew weighed hundreds of kilograms. Remove it. Self-sealing fuel tanks with their layers of rubber and complex construction weighed significantly more than simple aluminum tanks and reduced fuel capacity. Remove them. Fire suppression systems, armored glass, redundant controls, all the safety features that Western designers considered essential. Remove everything that doesn't directly contribute to range. But the Mitsubishi engineers weren't working in isolation or making these decisions arbitrarily. They had a template, a proof of concept that showed this philosophy could work. That template was the A6M Zero fighter, which first flew in 1939 and would become the most famous Japanese aircraft of the war. The Zero followed the exact same design philosophy: maximum range through minimum weight. It too lacked armor and self-sealing tanks. And in the early years of the war, it was devastatingly effective. When the Zero first encountered Allied fighters in China in 1940 and 1941, it outperformed them in every meaningful metric. It could fly farther, turn tighter, and climb faster than anything the Allies had. American pilots in P-40s and British pilots in Hurricanes found themselves completely outmatched. The Zero could escort bombers on missions that Allied planners thought impossible. It could appear over targets that should have been out of range. It seemed to violate the basic rules of aircraft design. The success of the Zero validated everything the Japanese believed about their design philosophy. Yes, the aircraft was vulnerable when hit, but if you could avoid being hit through superior maneuverability and tactical surprise, the vulnerability didn't matter. The mission was what mattered. Reaching the target was what mattered. The individual pilot, the individual aircraft, these were expendable resources in service of strategic objectives. This is where the philosophical divide between Japanese and American aviation doctrine becomes stark and unbridgeable. When American engineers designed aircraft, they started from a fundamentally different premise. The premise was this: an experienced crew is more valuable than any aircraft. Planes can be built in factories in a matter of weeks. Training a skilled pilot takes years. Therefore, the primary goal of aircraft design after accomplishing the mission is bringing the crew home alive. This philosophy was embedded in every American aircraft design from the beginning of the war. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name from the heavy defensive armament and armor protection it carried. Early models were considered underprotected, so later versions added more armor, more guns, more systems to keep crews alive. Yes, this added weight. Yes, it reduced range and speed. But it meant that crews who were shot up over Germany had a chance to make it back to England. And those crews would fly again, getting better with each mission, becoming more effective, training new crews with their experience. The cultural roots of this difference run deep. American democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights and the value of each citizen's life, naturally produced a military doctrine that prioritized crew survival. The industrial capacity of the United States meant that aircraft production was never the limiting factor. Trained crews were the bottleneck, so protecting them made economic and military sense. An American pilot who survived being shot down would be rescued, returned to duty, and fly again. The system was designed around the assumption that individual lives had intrinsic value beyond their immediate military utility. Japanese military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and the code of Bushido, operated from different assumptions. The individual existed to serve the collective, the nation, the emperor. Death in service was not a tragedy to be avoided, but an honor to be embraced. This wasn't mere propaganda or brainwashing. It was a genuine cultural framework that shaped how Japanese military planners thought about acceptable losses. If a mission required the sacrifice of the crew, that was the cost of war. The mission's success justified any price. So when the G4M Betty rolled out of Mitsubishi's factories in 1940, it was the perfect embodiment of Japanese naval aviation doctrine. It could carry a torpedo or 800 kilograms of bombs over 4,000 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from Tokyo to Guam, or from Rabaul to Darwin, Australia. No other medium bomber in the world could match this range. The Betty could strike targets that should have been safe, support operations across vast oceanic distances, and give Japan the strategic reach its empire required. The numbers tell the story. A fully loaded Betty weighed about 9,500 kilograms empty and could take off at up to 12,500 kilograms. Of that weight, nearly 4,400 kilograms was fuel. The fuel fraction, the percentage of takeoff weight devoted to fuel, was extraordinary. American bombers typically carried fuel fractions of 25 to 30%. The Betty was over 35% fuel by weight. This was achieved by making the fuel tanks integral to the wing structure, using every available cubic centimeter of space, and eliminating all the protective systems that would have reduced capacity. The crew of 7 men sat in a fuselage that was essentially a flying fuel tank. The wings on either side of them held thousands of liters of high-octane aviation gasoline in unprotected aluminum containers. The engines, powerful Mitsubishi radials producing 1,500 horsepower each, hung in nacelles without fire suppression systems. If an engine caught fire, and radial engines were prone to oil leaks and fires, there was no automatic system to extinguish it. The crew would have to fight the fire manually or watch it spread to the fuel tanks in the wing. But in December 1941, when Japan launched its war of conquest across the Pacific, none of these vulnerabilities mattered, because the Betty was fighting enemies who couldn't exploit them. The aircraft that opposed it in the early months of the war were older designs, often obsolete, flown by pilots who were unprepared for the speed and scope of Japanese operations. And in those early months, the Betty proved devastatingly effective. December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. American forces in the Philippines are on high alert, expecting a Japanese attack. But they're not expecting what comes. Betty bombers, flying from bases on Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, cross hundreds of miles of ocean to strike Clark Field, the main American airbase in the Philippines. The distance is at the extreme edge of what American planners thought possible for a bomber attack. The Bettys arrive with fighter escort, 0 fighters that have flown the same impossible distance, and catch American B-17 bombers lined up on the ground. The destruction is total. Dozens of American aircraft are destroyed before they can take off. The few that manage to get airborne are quickly shot down by Zeros. In a single day, American air power in the Philippines is effectively eliminated. And the weapon that made it possible was the Betty's extraordinary range. No American bomber could have flown that mission. The B-25s and B-26s that made up the backbone of American medium bomber forces simply didn't have the fuel capacity to fly from Formosa to central Luzon and back. 2 days later, December 10, 1941, the Betty achieved what many historians consider its greatest victory, and one of the most significant moments in naval warfare history. A British naval force designated Force Zede was steaming off the coast of Malaya. It consisted of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, and 4 destroyers. These were capital ships, the pride of the Royal Navy, sent to deter Japanese aggression in Southeast Asia. The Prince of Wales was one of Britain's newest and most powerful battleships, having fought the Bismarck just months earlier. Japanese naval aviation commanders in Indochina received reports of Force Z's position and launched a massive strike. 51 Betty bombers, armed with torpedoes and bombs, flew out over the South China Sea to find the British ships. They had no fighter escort. The distance was too great even for Zeros. The Bettys would have to attack alone, relying on their speed and the element of surprise. They found Force Z shortly after noon. The British ships had no air cover. The carrier that was supposed to accompany them had run aground and couldn't sail. The nearest British fighters were hundreds of miles away. The Bettys attacked in waves, coming in low to drop torpedoes and high to drop bombs. The British ships threw up intense anti-aircraft fire, shooting down several attackers. But there were too many bombers, and they were too determined. Torpedoes slammed into both capital ships. The Prince of Wales took multiple hits that damaged her propellers and steering. Dead in the water, she was hit again and again. The Repulse, more maneuverable, dodged 19 torpedoes before finally being struck by 4 in quick succession. Both ships capsized and sank within hours. Admiral Tom Phillips, commander of Force Z, went down with the Prince of Wales. Over 800 British sailors died. The strategic implications were staggering. For centuries, battleships had been the ultimate expression of naval power. They were considered nearly invulnerable to air attack, especially while underway and able to maneuver. The sinking of Force Z proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Capital ships without air cover were helpless against determined air attack. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun, and the weapon that proved this was the Betty bomber. Its range had allowed it to find and attack ships far from any Japanese airbase. Its payload capacity allowed it to carry the heavy torpedoes needed to sink battleships. The lack of armor and protection that would later doom the Betty didn't matter in this engagement because the British had no fighters to exploit that weakness. The Betty did exactly what it was designed to do: project devastating striking power across distances that the enemy thought were safe. Through 1942, the Betty continued to prove its worth. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and into the Pacific, conquering an empire larger than any in history. The Betty was everywhere, supporting operations from Burma to the Solomon Islands. It bombed Darwin, Australia in February 1942, flying from bases in the Dutch East Indies. It attacked Allied shipping across thousands of miles of ocean. It supported the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal, flying from Rabaul in New Britain, a distance of over 1,000 kilometers round trip. American and Australian forces fighting in the South Pacific in 1942 learned to fear the Betty. It would appear without warning, strike hard, and disappear before fighters could intercept it. Its speed, over 400 kilometers per hour, made it difficult to catch. Its range meant it could come from anywhere. And its payload, whether bombs or torpedoes, was devastating to ships and ground installations. But even in these early victories, the seeds of the Betty's eventual failure were being planted. Japanese aircrew losses, even in successful missions, were significant. A Betty hit by anti-aircraft fire rarely made it home. The unprotected fuel tanks meant that any damage to the wings usually resulted in fire and catastrophic loss of the aircraft. Crews that ditched in the ocean, far from any base, had little chance of rescue. Japan's vast empire meant that search and rescue operations were nearly impossible across most of the Pacific. The Japanese military accepted these losses as the cost of their strategic reach. In the calculus of Bushido, the death of a crew in successful completion of their mission was honorable and acceptable. What mattered was that the missions were succeeding. The Philippines fell, Malaya fell, Singapore fell, the Dutch East Indies fell. The Betty and the Zero were the instruments of this conquest, and their design philosophy seemed vindicated by victory. But war is a dynamic process, and the Allies were learning. American factories were producing new aircraft designs that incorporated the hard lessons of early combat. Engineers were building fighters with more powerful engines, heavier armament, and most critically, the range to operate across Pacific distances while still maintaining armor protection and self-sealing tanks. The industrial might of the United States, once fully mobilized, could produce aircraft that didn't have to choose between range and survivability. American planes could have both. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in early 1943. It was designed specifically to counter the Zero, and by extension to dominate Japanese naval aviation. The Hellcat had a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was fast, over 600 kilometers per hour. It was tough, with armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. And, critically, it had the range to escort bombers and patrol large areas of ocean. The Hellcat could do everything the Zero could do except turn as tightly, and it could do it while bringing its pilot home alive. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, already in service but now arriving in larger numbers, was another game-changer. Its twin-engine design gave it enormous range, over 700 kilometers combat radius. Its heavy armament, 4 machine guns and a cannon concentrated in the nose, could shred enemy aircraft. And its speed and altitude performance meant it could choose when and where to fight. A P-38 pilot who spotted a Betty formation could climb above them, dive to attack speed, and tear through the bombers before their gunners could react effectively. The Chance Vought F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wings, combined speed, range, and firepower in a package that Japanese pilots came to dread. The Corsair could fly over 700 kilometers per hour in a dive, faster than any Japanese aircraft could manage. Its 6 heavy machine guns could saw a Betty in half with a single burst. As these aircraft arrived in the Pacific in growing numbers through 1943, the vulnerability of the Betty became impossible to ignore. American pilots quickly learned that the Betty would burn if you hit it almost anywhere. The fuel tanks in the wings were the obvious target, but even hits to the fuselage often started fires because fuel lines ran through the aircraft unprotected. Tracer ammunition, which American fighters used to help pilots aim, was particularly deadly. The burning phosphorus in tracer rounds would ignite fuel vapor instantly. American pilots started calling the Betty the Flying Zippo after the popular cigarette lighter. Some called it the one-shot lighter, because it often took only a single burst to set one on fire. These weren't jokes born of disrespect for the enemy. They were observations of a terrible reality. The Betty, which had seemed so formidable in 1941 and 1942, was revealed as a death trap once it faced opponents who could exploit its weaknesses. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 demonstrated this with brutal clarity. A Japanese convoy was attempting to reinforce their garrison at Lae in New Guinea. The convoy consisted of 8 transports carrying 6,900 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers, and protected by fighters and Betty bombers flying from Rabaul. Allied intelligence detected the convoy, and American and Australian air forces launched a massive attack. The battle lasted 3 days. Allied bombers, primarily B-25 Mitchells using a new skip bombing technique, devastated the convoy. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. But the Betty bombers trying to protect the convoy suffered catastrophic losses. American P-38 fighters intercepted them repeatedly. The Bettys, loaded with bombs and fuel for the long flight from Rabaul, were helpless against the faster, more maneuverable and heavily armed American fighters. Witnesses described Bettys exploding in mid-air from single bursts of gunfire. Others broke apart as fires spread from punctured fuel tanks to the wing structure. Some managed to drop their bombs before being shot down, but most never reached their targets. Of the dozens of Bettys committed to the battle, more than half were destroyed. The survivors limped back to Rabaul, many damaged, their crews traumatized by the slaughter they'd witnessed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point. Japanese commanders could no longer ignore the fact that their bombers were being shot out of the sky at unsustainable rates. But they faced an impossible dilemma. The Betty's range was still essential to Japanese strategy. Without it, they couldn't defend their far-flung bases or strike at Allied positions across the vast Pacific. But sending Bettys into combat against modern American fighters was increasingly a suicide mission. Japanese engineers attempted modifications. The G4M2 variant, introduced in 1943, added some armor protection and improved the fuel tank design slightly. But any meaningful protection added weight, which reduced range, which defeated the entire purpose of the aircraft. The G4M3 variant, introduced in 1944, had even more protection and more powerful engines to compensate for the added weight. But by then, it was too late. American air superiority was overwhelming, and no amount of incremental improvement could save an aircraft built on fundamentally flawed assumptions. The human cost of the Betty's design philosophy became impossible to ignore. Japanese naval aviation was bleeding experienced crews at a rate that couldn't be sustained. Unlike American pilots, who often survived being shot down and returned to combat, Japanese air crews who went down over the Pacific rarely came home. The distances were too great, the ocean too vast, and Japanese search and rescue capabilities too limited. Every Betty that exploded in flames took 7 trained men with it, men who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience. By 1944, Japan was facing a crisis in aircrew quality. The experienced pilots and bombardiers who had trained for years before the war were mostly dead. Their replacements had far less training, sometimes only a few months, because Japan lacked the fuel and time to train them properly. These inexperienced crews, flying vulnerable aircraft against overwhelming American air superiority, died even faster than their predecessors. It was a death spiral from which there was no recovery. The most symbolically devastating loss came on April 18, 1943. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, was conducting an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. American intelligence intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications detailing Yamamoto's flight schedule. He would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville in a Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. American commanders made the decision to intercept and kill Yamamoto. It was a controversial decision, targeting a specific individual for assassination, but the strategic value was considered too great to pass up. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron took off from Guadalcanal on a mission that would require flying over 700 kilometers at wavetop height to avoid radar detection, intercepting Yamamoto's flight at a precise time and location, and fighting their way out against superior numbers of Japanese fighters. The mission succeeded with devastating precision. The P-38s arrived exactly on time and spotted Yamamoto's Betty and its escort. In the brief, violent combat that followed, both Betty bombers in the flight were shot down. Yamamoto's aircraft crashed in the jungle of Bougainville. The admiral's body was found in the wreckage the next day. He had been thrown from the aircraft, still strapped in his seat, killed by the crash or by the bullets that had torn through the unprotected fuselage. Yamamoto's death in a Betty bomber was grimly appropriate. He had been one of the architects of Japanese naval aviation doctrine, including the emphasis on range over protection. He had approved the specifications for the Betty and the Zero. He had championed the strategy that those aircraft enabled. And he died in the aircraft that embodied that strategy, killed because the Betty couldn't protect him from American fighters that had the range to reach him and the firepower to destroy his aircraft with a single pass. The loss of Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and leadership, but it was also a perfect illustration of how completely the balance of air power had shifted. In 1941, the Betty's range had been an overwhelming advantage. By 1943, American fighters could match that range while also having the speed, firepower, and protection to dominate any engagement. The Betty had gone from being a strategic asset to a liability in less than 2 years. As the war ground on through 1944 and into 1945, the Betty's role became increasingly desperate. With American forces island-hopping across the Pacific, Japanese bases were being overrun or bypassed. The Betty's range, once its greatest asset, became less relevant as there were fewer and fewer bases from which to operate. The aircraft that remained were increasingly used for kamikaze missions, the ultimate expression of the expendable crew philosophy that had shaped their design. The most bizarre and desperate use of the Betty came with the Oka program. The Oka was a rocket-powered flying bomb, essentially a manned missile, carried under a Betty bomber and released near Allied ships. The Oka pilot would then guide his rocket bomb into the target, dying in the explosion. The Betty became a kamikaze carrier, hauling suicide weapons into range of American fleets. But the Bettys carrying Okas were slow, vulnerable, and easy to spot. American fighters shot them down long before they could release their deadly cargo. The crews of both the Betty and the Oka died without accomplishing anything. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Betty was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Japanese military strategy. Of the 2,435 G4M aircraft built during the war, the vast majority were destroyed in combat or lost to accidents. The loss rate was estimated at 60 to 70%, catastrophically high compared to American bomber loss rates of 5 to 10%. Thousands of Japanese airmen died in Bettys, their deaths accomplishing less and less as American air superiority became absolute. Back in that hangar in 1943, The American engineers examining the captured Betty finally understood what they were looking at. This wasn't a failure of engineering. It wasn't evidence of Japanese incompetence or resource poverty. It was a perfectly executed design that achieved exactly what it was meant to achieve. The problem wasn't the execution, it was the philosophy behind it. The engineers wrote detailed reports on the Betty's construction, noting its strengths and weaknesses. They marveled at the quality of the manufacturing and the elegance of some design solutions. But they also noted, with a mixture of horror and incomprehension, the complete absence of crew protection. Their reports influenced American tactical doctrine. Pilots were briefed to target the wings and fuel tanks of Japanese bombers. Gunners were told that Japanese aircraft would burn easily. Intelligence officers used the Betty as a case study in understanding Japanese military culture and its acceptance of casualties that Western militaries would consider unacceptable. The broader lesson took longer to sink in. American military planners had assumed that all nations would approach aircraft design with similar priorities: mission capability, balanced against crew survivability. The Betty proved that assumption wrong. An enemy operating from completely different cultural and philosophical premises would make completely different design choices. Understanding those choices required understanding the enemy's values, not just their technology. This lesson has echoed through military history ever since. During the Cold War, American analysts studying Soviet aircraft designs had to constantly remind themselves not to assume Soviet priorities matched American ones. Soviet fighters often had shorter range and less sophisticated avionics than American fighters, but they were designed for a different kind of war, fighting over Soviet territory with ground control guidance. Understanding the design required understanding the doctrine, which required understanding the culture and strategic situation that produced the doctrine. In the modern era, the lesson remains relevant. Unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, represent a return to the idea of expendable aircraft. A Predator or Reaper drone costs a fraction of what an F-35 costs, and if it's shot down, no pilot dies. The calculus that Japanese engineers made in 1937, trading survivability for capability, is being made again, but with machines instead of men. The difference is that modern militaries make this choice consciously, designing some systems to be expendable and others to be survivable, rather than applying one philosophy to all aircraft. The Betty's legacy is complex. As an aircraft, it was a remarkable achievement. It did things that contemporary designs couldn't match. Its range enabled operations that shaped the early course of the Pacific War. Japanese engineers solved difficult problems and created an aircraft that met its specifications brilliantly. But those specifications were based on a philosophy that valued mission success over human life, to a degree that proved unsustainable in a long war of attrition. The American engineers who examined that captured Betty learned something that day that went far beyond technical intelligence. They learned that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with superior technology, but the one who plays by completely different rules. They learned that understanding an enemy's weapons requires understanding their values, and they learned that some philosophical divides are so fundamental that they shape everything from grand strategy down to the thickness of a fuel tank wall. In the end, the Betty didn't fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because the philosophy that created it demanded a price that no nation could pay indefinitely. Japan's industrial base couldn't replace aircraft losses at American rates. Japan's training system couldn't replace experienced crews fast enough. And Japanese society, for all its emphasis on sacrifice and duty, couldn't sustain the psychological toll of watching its best and brightest burn in aircraft that were designed to be death traps. The American approach, protecting crews even at the cost of some performance, proved superior not because it was more humane, though it was, but because it was more sustainable. American pilots who survived being shot down came home, trained new pilots, and flew again. American crews learned from their experiences and got better. The system created a virtuous cycle where experience accumulated and capability increased over time. The Japanese system created a death spiral where experience was lost faster than it could be replaced. Standing in that hangar, looking at the elegant lines of the Betty bomber, those American engineers saw a mirror. They saw their own assumptions reflected back at them, revealed as assumptions rather than universal truths. They saw that aircraft design is not a purely technical problem with objectively correct solutions. It's a problem shaped by culture, by values, by the fundamental question of what price you're willing to pay for victory. The Betty was the answer to that question from a nation that was willing to pay any price. And in the end, that willingness to sacrifice everything, embodied in an aircraft with extraordinary range and no protection for its crew, was not enough. The nation that valued bringing its people home, that built its aircraft around the assumption that human life was worth the weight of armor and self-sealing tanks, won the war. Not because their technology was superior, though eventually it was, but because their philosophy was sustainable and Japan's was not. That captured Betty, sitting under harsh lights in a South Pacific hangar, was more than an intelligence windfall. It was a lesson in how deeply culture shapes technology and how technology reveals culture. The engineers who examined it that day learned to question everything they thought they knew, and in doing so, they understood their enemy and themselves more clearly than ever before. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into the untold stories of history, engineering, and the human decisions that shaped our world. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you these detailed, well-researched narratives that go beyond the surface. If you're already part of our community, thank you. Please hit that like button to help this video reach more history enthusiasts who appreciate the complexity behind the machines and the minds that created them. And here's where we really want to hear from you. What other World War II aircraft or technologies do you think embodied a unique national philosophy? Was it the British Spitfire's balance of performance and practicality? The German focus on technological sophistication in their jets? The Soviet emphasis on ruggedness and simplicity? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. We read every single one, and your suggestions often inspire our next deep dives into history. Remember, understanding the past isn't just about memorizing dates and battles. It's about recognizing the assumptions, values, and philosophies that drove people to make the choices they made. Sometimes those choices led to triumph. Sometimes, as with the Betty bomber, they led to tragedy. But they always reveal something profound about human nature and the cultures we create. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.